During the company dinner, her eyes sparkled like never before. She smiled as if nothing could destroy her, but I knew. I knew everything. The red dress she chose, the perfume that seemed to scream for attention, and the way she leaned her body toward him, the man who signed my checks, the man I respected. My boss. Her lover. My fingers shook as I held the wine glass, but my voice didn't falter. I waited until the right moment, until the perfect silence settled between the laughter and toasts to speak. The words came out sharp, filled with contempt. We are getting divorced. I found out everything about you and your lover. And I know he's the boss. She froze. The smile disappeared, and the sparkle in his eyes went out like a flame crushed by the wind. The eyes around the table turned to us. Some glasses stopped halfway to their lips, others fell and spread the red liquid across the floor like blood. She tried to open her mouth, maybe to deny, maybe to beg. But there was no time for answers. I didn't want answers. I wanted to watch as her world fell apart. At that moment, everything got mixed up in my head, the hidden kisses, the deleted messages, the excuses to leave earlier or arrive later. I had seen the traces of perfume on her shirt that weren't mine and the expensive gifts that appeared without explanation. I had told the lies one by one, until they all formed a grotesque mosaic that revealed the truth. She swore she loved me. He swore for years. And now, there, in front of everyone, the truth burned in my throat like poison. The man she had chosen in secret, the same man who shook my hand in meetings, who promoted me and praised my work, now looked at me with the wide eyes of a coward caught in the act. I got up from the table without waiting for any response. The sound of her heels on the floor echoed behind me. She followed me, begging. Let me explain, please, I can explain. Her voice shook, but I kept walking, feeling each stare burning into my back. When we reached the empty hallway, I turned around. Explain what? That you cheated on me with my boss. That while I was working to support this house, you were between his sheets. Explain how you looked me in the eye and told me you loved me when you were stabbing me in the back. She cried. She tried to hold my hand, but I pulled her away. This is crazy. I love you. It was a mistake, a stupid mistake, I was confused, I cut her off. Confused? Confused while climbing into his car. Confused while choosing new underwear to please him. Confused when he kissed me before leaving to meet him. Her words turned into desperate sobs. But there was no room for pity. She destroyed everything. Every promise, every plan, every moment. I gave her my heart, and she shattered it without hesitation. But there was something she didn't know. Something I discovered that afternoon, before heading to dinner. Something that would make this betrayal even more cruel. She tried to manipulate everything, even the separation. And when I pulled the envelope out of my pocket, handing over the documents that were already ready, her face turned pale. This can't be happening, she whispered. Please, let's talk about this. Don't do that here. But it was already too late. She had already done it, and now I was returning the blow. The company dinner ended in silence. No one dared to approach. He, the lover, the boss, didn't have the courage to say anything. He disappeared from the table like a thief fleeing a robbery. And me? I left there with something more than anger. I came out with a plan. A plan that would ensure none of them got away with it. Because while they were plotting lies and betrayals, I had already plotted my revenge. But what she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that I had something even bigger to reveal. Something that would not only destroy their case, but also rip the ground they stood on from beneath them. And when the time came, they would understand that the game was far from over. Because the worst secret had not yet been revealed. And when it was, neither she nor he would be prepared for the impact. Welcome to the channel where we reveal the darkest secrets and devastating consequences of betrayal. Here, we never support or encourage infidelity. All the stories are fictional, but they carry a powerful lesson about how betrayal can destroy lives, families and dreams. Get ready to dive into an intense narrative, full of twists and emotions. This story will grip you from beginning to end and leave you breathless. Now, sit back, take a deep breath and be ready to hear a shocking story. The restaurant's soft lights cast golden reflections on the wine glasses carefully positioned on the table, while discreet smiles and hushed conversations made up the evening's elegant setting. Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his impeccably pressed shirt and looked around, taking in the details of the sophisticated surroundings. There was always something magnetic about events like that, something that made him feel part of a select circle, even if inside he still carried traces of the insecure young man who started with nothing. His presence there, among the successful executives and their stunning wives, was further proof of how much he had achieved. Beside her, Claire adjusted her impeccably styled blonde hair, discreetly matching the reflection of the crystal glass. She exuded elegance, but also a serenity cultivated over the years. Claire was the kind of woman who knew how to carry herself, how to speak, how to charm without seeming forced. Ethan had always admired this ability in her. It was as if Claire was born to occupy that space, always comfortable in the spotlight, always sure of herself. But that night, something about Claire seemed different. She looked beautiful, as always, but there was a subtle tension in her shoulders, a lost look that Ethan couldn't decipher. For a moment he wanted to ask if something was wrong, but he stopped himself. That night was important. He had tried too hard to get here and he wasn't going to let extraneous thoughts get in the way. The two had a story that could easily be described as inspiring. Ethan and Claire met in college, when he was still sharing a cramped apartment with two friends and surviving on odd jobs, while she was already attracting attention as one of the most promising students on the marketing course. Claire seemed unreachable at the time, but he won her heart with his determination and understated charm. The following years were marked by sacrifices and achievements. Ethan has built a solid career in business management, while Claire has excelled in the world of interior design. They were the perfect couple in the eyes of others, young, ambitious and deeply in love. Ethan often said that Claire was his anchor, the woman who kept him centered as he navigated the turbulent waters of business. Their marriage seemed unshakable. Romantic trips, lovingly planned dinners, unexpected surprises. For a long time, all of this was enough to keep the flame burning. But as with many couples, the years have brought subtle changes. The previously spontaneous smiles began to seem rehearsed. Long conversations were replaced by comfortable silences, and romantic dinners gave way to quick meals in front of the television. Still, Ethan never doubted Claire. There was something about the way she looked at him, even when they were silent, that made him feel safe. He knew that the work demanded a lot from both of them, he knew that the tiring days sometimes took away their enthusiasm, but he believed that this was all part of the process. In recent months, however, Ethan has begun to notice subtle changes. Claire started leaving earlier and arriving later. His messages became shorter and his apologies more frequent. Still, he didn't question it. Not because I didn't want to know, but because I trusted her. He always trusted. That night, as Claire laughed at something Ethan's boss said across the table, he watched her with a mix of pride and uneasiness. There was a lightness in the way she smiled, an ease he hadn't seen in a long time. For a moment, he wondered if that smile was meant for him or if, somehow, Claire had already tuned out. But Ethan shook the thought away as quickly as it came. He had plans for that night, plans to rekindle the flame between them. Maybe it was just nervousness that made him question. He had already spent so much time preparing for that moment, invested so many hours in that project that would make him even more stable, that the idea of losing Claire seemed absurd. Across the room, Claire looked away from her boss and met Ethan's eyes. She smiled, but the smile seemed forced, as if she wanted to convince him of something. He responded with a discreet wave, even though he felt the weight of that expression. Something was wrong. As the conversation at the table continued, Ethan struggled to ignore the thoughts that kept creeping in. He remembered when Claire started leaving her cell phone face down, something she never did before. Of the connections that ended abruptly as soon as he entered the room. Of the gifts that appeared without explanation. He wanted to believe that everything had a logical explanation, wanted to ignore the growing feeling that there was something happening right before his eyes. After all, Claire had always been honest. Always. But as he sat there, watching her laugh and talk so naturally, Ethan felt the first thread of doubt curl around his throat. The air became heavy, and he had to force himself to take a deep breath. That night was supposed to be a celebration. He refused to change her into something different. When the waiter approached to refill his glass, Ethan noticed how much his hand was shaking. He disguised it, adjusting his tie and smiling at his colleagues. I needed to maintain control. The night continued with speeches and toasts, but Ethan's mind was far from there. He barely heard his boss' words as he praised the last quarter's results or the laughter that echoed after inside jokes. All I could focus on was Claire and the little details that had gone unnoticed for so long. As applause filled the room, Ethan looked back at Claire. She looked beautiful, but there was something in her eyes that he couldn't decipher. Something that seemed to scream for help and, at the same time, hide a secret. And then, as the boss stood up for another speech, Ethan noticed the brief glance Claire cast in his direction. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but enough that everything he tried to ignore finally clicked into place. And in that moment, Ethan knew that nothing would ever be the same. Ethan twirled the ring on his finger as he stared at the glass of whiskey in front of him. The ice had melted, but he didn't move to take a sip. The hotel bar was almost empty, except for some muffled conversations and the occasional sound of a glass landing on the counter. He shouldn't be there. Not at that moment. Not alone. Still, he couldn't muster the strength to go back to the room where Claire was probably already sleeping, or pretending to be. That night should have been different. He had planned everything, from the clothes he would wear to the exact words he would use to surprise her with tickets for the trip she always wanted to take. He wanted to rekindle something between them, something that seemed to be disappearing like smoke. But instead, he ended up sitting in a bar, feeling the weight of a distrust he could no longer ignore. The memory of Claire's look during dinner was still stuck in his mind. It wasn't just the look, but the way she behaved all night, as if she was torn between two worlds and desperately trying to keep up appearances. Ethan had spent years learning to interpret her silences, her subtle gestures and her smiles that didn't reach her eyes. And that night, he saw something different, something that made him feel like the ground beneath his feet was about to crumble. When he finally went up to his room, the narrow hallway seemed longer than ever. He carefully unlocked the door, expecting to find Claire lying on the bed, perhaps already asleep. But she wasn't there. The room was empty, the lights were off, and the bed was untouched. Ethan felt his heart speed up. He tried to convince himself that she might have gone downstairs to get something or maybe she was at the hotel spa. Still, his instincts screamed something different. He sat on the edge of the bed and waited. Minutes turned into almost an hour until the sound of the door opening brought him out of his thoughts. Claire hurried in, her hair a little messy, as if she had run her hands through it several times. She stopped when she saw him sitting there. He watched her, noticing how her eyes widened for a brief second before regaining her composure. Claire smiled, but the smile looked so fragile that it could break at any moment. She said she went to get some tea in the lobby and didn't want to disturb him, but her voice trailed off on the last word. Ethan didn't respond right away. He just stared at her, searching in her eyes for something that would confirm what he already feared. The following days were marked by a silence that weighed more than any discussion. Claire avoided meeting his gaze, and Ethan began to notice small details that he had previously ignored. Her cell phone, which never left her side, the messages that arrived late at night, the calls that were answered beyond her reach. He was trying to shake the thoughts away, but every clue led him back to the same conclusion. The following week, Ethan decided to put an end to his doubts. While Claire took a shower, he took her cell phone from the bedside table. His hands shook as he unlocked the screen. Recent messages didn't show anything compromising, but he knew where to look. It was in the deleted photos that he found what he was looking for. The first image was too innocent to be worrying. Claire was smiling at a dinner table, holding a glass of wine. But in the next photo, her smile was directed at someone. The man sitting next to her, in a suit, with his hand casually resting on her leg, was someone Ethan knew all too well. The boss. The shock made Ethan's chest tighten. He kept scrolling through the photos, seeing Claire in different moments, smiling, dancing, her eyes shining in a way he hadn't seen in years. The dates were there. While he was working late, while he was organizing plans for their future, she was living another life. When Claire came out of the bathroom, drying her hair, she found Ethan sitting on the bed with her cell phone in her hands. He didn't need to say anything. Her face instantly turned pale, and the words she tried to form caught in her throat. Ethan didn't scream. He didn't throw anything against the wall. He just got up and walked towards the door. Claire ran after him, begging him to stay and listen to her. He said he could explain, that it wasn't what it seemed. But he already knew. You knew it from the moment you saw the first photo. When he went down to the lobby, he felt the air heavy. Everything seemed to spin in slow motion. The boss's face appeared in his mind, the confident smiles during meetings, the words of encouragement, the promotions that seemed so deserved. Now, every gesture seemed loaded with ulterior motives. Claire caught up with him in the lobby, pulling him by the arm. She cried, saying she had made a mistake, that she never wanted to hurt him, that she still loved him. Ethan turned to face her, and in that moment he realized how hurt he was. Not just because of the betrayal, but because of the way it had all happened, the broken trust, the carefully constructed lies, the humiliation of knowing that he had been deceived by two people close to him. Claire kept talking, trying to fill the silence between them, but Ethan could barely hear her. His mind was already elsewhere, calculating his next steps. Anger was slowly growing, mixed with a dark desire for revenge. He left the hotel without looking back, leaving Claire alone in the lobby. But it wasn't the end. Not yet. Because Ethan knew there was more to the story. Something Claire was desperately trying to hide. And when the truth came out, none of them would be prepared for the impact. Claire was sitting on the sofa, her eyes fixed on the closed door. The lights in the apartment seemed colder, almost oppressive, as silence spread like a suffocating presence. She knew Ethan would come back. I knew because I knew him better than anyone. He wouldn't let the situation end like that. There was anger in his eyes, yes, but there were also questions, and Claire feared the questions more than the screams. She clasped her hands in her lap, trying to calm her uneven breathing, but the sound of the key turning in the lock made her heart race. Ethan entered and closed the door firmly. His eyes were cold, hard, as if the person she knew had disappeared. Claire tried to get up, but he raised his hand, ordering her to stay where she was. For a moment, she thought about running to hug him, begging for forgiveness again, but she knew he wasn't there for that. He pulled out a chair, sat down opposite her and placed a manila envelope on the table. Claire swallowed. Ethan broke the silence first. His voice was low, but it carried a cutting weight. He said he needed to hear the truth, the whole truth, and that this time he wouldn't accept half words or vague excuses. Claire felt her throat tighten, but she knew she had nowhere else to run. She started saying that she never wanted to hurt him, that everything got out of control, but Ethan slammed his hand on the table, making her wince. He wanted the truth, not regrets. She started slowly, talking about how she felt neglected in recent years, how she had lost herself between the roles of perfect wife and invisible woman. I said I wasn't justifying anything, but I needed him to understand how he got there. Ethan interrupted her, saying that nothing justified what she did, and Claire didn't disagree. Tears began to stream down her face as she admitted that the affair with her boss began as something superficial, something she believed she could control. She said he made her feel wanted, valued, but she soon realized she had crossed a line she couldn't come back from. Ethan listened in silence, his muscles tense, but what hurt most was the look in his eyes, a mix of disappointment and contained fury. Claire continued, saying that she tried to end everything several times, but her boss always found a way to get her back, using sweet words and empty promises. She wanted to end it, but each attempt seemed to drag her deeper into the chaos. It was then that Ethan took the envelope and opened it. He took a set of documents out of it and placed them on the table. Claire looked at the papers and felt her stomach drop. There were bank statements, contracts and money transfer records. Ethan pointed to the signatures and asked if she recognized them. Claire started to deny it, but stopped when she saw his expression. He knew. Ethan knew that Claire and her boss were embezzling money from the company. He knew that she had signed documents authorizing the transfers, that she had lied not only to him, but also to herself. Claire tried to explain that she didn't know what she was getting into, that she only signed because her boss said it was something temporary, a financial maneuver that would be resolved in a few weeks. Ethan laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. He asked her if she really thought he would believe that. He said that while he was working to secure a future for them both, Claire was digging herself into a hole she might never be able to climb out of. She tried to hold his hand, but Ethan pulled his arm away. He asked her if she had any idea what that meant, if she understood that she could be arrested for fraud. Claire panicked. She said she never wanted to harm anyone, that she was manipulated, that she believed everything her boss said. She begged Ethan to help her, to find a solution together, but he got up and started walking around the apartment. He said he couldn't believe she had been so naive, so weak. He asked how many times she lied while looking into his eyes, how many nights she slept next to him knowing what she was doing. Claire fell to her knees, crying, saying she would do anything to make right what she had done. She promised to confess everything, go to the police if necessary, as long as he didn't abandon her. Ethan stood still for a moment, looking at her as if he were looking at a stranger. He said he no longer knew who she was, that he could no longer trust her. But Claire got up and grabbed his arm, desperate. She said her boss threatened her when she tried to leave, that he used personal information to keep her under control. She said that her boss had copies of the messages, emails and transfers, and that if she didn't continue, he would turn everything over to the police, ruining not only her, but Ethan as well. Ethan's anger reached its peak. He hit the table, knocking over the glass that was still there. He screamed that Claire should have trusted him, that together they could have handled any problem, but instead she chose to betray him and put him at risk. Claire tried to defend herself, saying that she was scared, that she didn't know how to get out of that situation, but Ethan didn't want to hear it anymore. He took the documents and left the apartment, leaving Claire collapsed on the floor. She screamed for him, begged him to come back, but the door had already closed. Claire felt the weight of the consequences bearing down on her like an avalanche. Outside, Ethan walked aimlessly, feeling his chest tighten. Claire's betrayal was an open wound, but what consumed him most was the feeling that everything had been a farce, the love, the plans, the dreams. And now, he knew he needed to decide his next step, but he also knew that the game was far from over. Ethan drove aimlessly, the city lights passing by in blurs as anger and disappointment pulsed inside him. His breathing was heavy, and his hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. He stopped at a red light but was unable to look ahead. Thoughts kept coming back to Claire, to the words spoken, to her tears and to the apologies that seemed so empty. He didn't know if what hurt more was the betrayal or the fact that she had put everything they had built at risk through lies. The phone vibrated in the passenger seat. He looked at the name on the screen and pressed the button to reject the call. Claire had called at least 10 times since he left the apartment. The messages piled up, asking him to come back, to let her explain more, not to abandon her. But he didn't want to hear any more. At least not at that moment. He parked the car in front of the company office. The building was imposing and silent at that time of night. He didn't know why he went there, perhaps out of a need to feel in control of something, to remind himself that there was still something solid in his life. He used his access card to enter and walked to his room. The family environment did not bring the comfort I expected. Instead, everything felt charged, as if the walls held secrets he didn't want to face. He sat down at the table and pulled out the envelope again, scattering the documents on the glass top. The evidence was there, clear as day. Transfers signed by Claire, forged approvals and movements that led directly to the boss. His name was everywhere, but what was most revolting was seeing Claire's name next to it. The woman he loved had become the accomplice of the man he admired and respected. The door to the room suddenly opened, and Ethan looked up in surprise. Claire was there, her eyes red and swollen, her face pale. She held a bag like it was her last anchor and closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment before taking a tentative step inside. He stood up, his chair scraping on the floor, and asked her what she was doing there. Claire replied that she couldn't leave him alone, that she couldn't accept that everything ended that way. She moved forward, but Ethan raised his hand, telling her to stop. I said there was nothing more to be said, but Claire didn't accept it. She began to speak, too quickly, almost desperately. She said she was sorry, that she had been manipulated, that she never wanted to hurt him. She said that her boss involved her little by little, starting with small requests for favors and, before she knew it, she was caught up in something much bigger than she imagined. She said she tried to leave, but he threatened to expose everything, he threatened to ruin Ethan and that she just wanted to protect him. Ethan laughed, a short, humorless sound, and asked how lying and cheating on him could be considered protection. Claire moved closer and tried to hold his hand, but he pulled away, refusing her touch. He said he no longer knew who she was, that he looked at her and saw a stranger. Claire fell to her knees, the tears coming back with a vengeance. She begged for another chance, asked him not to give up on them, said she would do anything to make right what she had done. But Ethan shook his head, saying that there were certain things that couldn't be undone. The door to the room opened again, and the two turned to see their boss standing there. He walked in with his usual confidence, but there was something in his eyes, an uneasiness hidden beneath the controlled facade. He looked at Claire and then at Ethan, saying he thought it was best for everyone to talk like adults. Ethan lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar of his jacket and pushing him against the wall. He said he already knew everything, that he had proof and that he wouldn't let it go. The boss smiled, even under pressure, and said that Ethan needed to think carefully before acting. He had power, connections, and if Ethan wanted to take him down, he would take Claire with him. Claire screamed for him to stop, trying to separate the two, but Ethan didn't budge. He said he would rather see her pay for what she did than continue living a lie. The boss took advantage of the distraction to loosen up, adjusting his clothes with a provocative smile. Then he dropped the bomb. He said that Claire not only knew everything, but was also helping to hide the money in a separate account. He showed copies of additional documents, revealing that part of the transfers went to an account in her name. Ethan looked at Claire, expecting a denial, but she lowered her head. The boss continued, saying that Claire was protecting herself and that if she wanted to, she could take them both down at once. Ethan felt his blood boil. He grabbed the papers from the table and threw them in his face, saying he wasn't going to give in to blackmail. Claire tried to intervene, saying that she didn't know that her boss had done all that she just wanted to get out of that situation. But Ethan couldn't hear any more. He took the documents, left the room and left the two there, standing in the middle of the chaos they created. When he arrived at the parking lot, Ethan sat in the car and finally felt the weight of everything he had discovered. The betrayal, the lies, the stolen money. But what hurt most was realizing that Claire was no longer the woman he thought he knew. As the car's engine roared, Ethan knew the night wasn't over yet. He had a plan. And this time, there would be no room for regrets. Ethan drove through the empty streets, feeling the car's engine fill the silence that dominated his thoughts. The headlights cut through the darkness, but nothing illuminated the growing emptiness that took over him. The truth had been thrown onto the table like a bomb, scattering shrapnel everywhere, and now he had to deal with the consequences. The image of Claire kneeling, begging for forgiveness, mixed with the memory of the boss smiling, sure that he would get away with it. Ethan felt the bitter taste of humiliation still stuck in his throat, but there was no room for tears. Not now. His hand tightened on the steering wheel as he remembered his boss's words. The implied threat to destroy not only Claire, but also his life, was a cruel reminder of how this man played people like they were disposable parts. Ethan knew that the boss hadn't gotten this far without being prepared to face any opponent. But what he didn't know was that Ethan no longer had anything to lose. He stopped the car in front of the apartment of an old friend, someone he knew he could trust. He went downstairs and knocked loudly on the door, expecting a quick response. When the door opened, he was met with a confused look on the other side, but he didn't waste time explaining. He said he needed help, he needed someone who didn't ask questions and was willing to face the fire alongside him. The friend hesitated for a moment, but Ethan's look was enough to convince him that this was no ordinary request. Sitting on the couch, Ethan spread the documents on the table, showing his friend every detail of what he had discovered. He explained how Claire had gotten involved with her boss, how they had embezzled money, and how he had been made a fool of for months. The friend listened in silence, nodding from time to time, but without interrupting. When Ethan finished, there was a heavy silence in the room, broken only by the distant sound of traffic on the street. The friend looked at him and asked if he was really prepared to go all the way, because this wouldn't just be a divorce. Ethan knew the right response would be to hesitate, but he didn't. He said he couldn't let this go, that he needed to see justice, not just for him, but for everyone else who had been manipulated by the boss. He knew Claire would have to pay the price too, and that hurt more than he was willing to admit. Returning home, Ethan found Claire sitting on the floor of the apartment, surrounded by open suitcases and scattered clothes. She looked at him with puffy, tired eyes, as if she hadn't slept since they last saw each other. She tried to get up, but he raised his hand, telling her to stay where she was. Claire asked if he was back to stay or just to get her for good, but Ethan ignored the question. He said he needed to know everything, every detail, every decision she made. Claire swallowed hard, trying to organize her thoughts, but began to speak. She told how her boss approached her, using praise and promises to gain her trust, and how it all started as a dangerous game that she believed she controlled. She admitted that at some point she fell in love with the feeling of being desired, of being important, but soon realized that she was on a path of no return. She cried as she said she tried to leave, that she tried to protect Ethan from the impact of her decisions, but the boss kept pulling her back, reminding her of the evidence he had against her and the veiled threats against Ethan's future. Claire said she was terrified, that she felt like she was walking a tightrope, always on the verge of falling, but Ethan showed no reaction. He asked her why she never told him anything before, why she chose to trust her boss instead of him. Claire said she didn't know, that she was too embarrassed to tell him, that she thought she could fix everything before he found out. Ethan approached, looking into her eyes, and asked if there was something more, something she hadn't told him yet. Claire hesitated, and he knew there was more. She confessed that the money was not only hidden, but some of it had already been spent. She said her boss convinced her to invest in fictitious businesses, and now the money was spread out in untraceable accounts. Ethan felt his stomach turn, but he held his ground. He said that it was no longer his problem, that she would have to deal with the consequences. Claire begged him not to give up on her, to help her get out of that mess, but Ethan just took the documents and left again, leaving her crying on the floor. He knew this wasn't the end, but he needed time to think, to figure out the next step. As he drove, his thoughts came together, forming a plan. He knew he couldn't trust his boss, but he also knew he couldn't just expose everything without protecting himself. He needed to find additional evidence, something he could use to take down the boss without taking Claire along. No matter how much she had betrayed him, part of him still wanted to protect her, even if he couldn't forgive her. Ethan returned to the office in the middle of the night, sifting through files, emails, and financial records. Each discovery made him angrier, more determined. He found documents that showed transfers made to other employees, evidence that the scheme went far beyond Claire. That man had turned the company into a board, manipulating everyone around. The next morning, Ethan found Claire waiting for him in the parking lot. She was pale and visibly haggard, but determined. He said he wanted to help, that he had thought through the night and knew where to find the evidence he needed. Ethan hesitated, but accepted the help. Together, they entered the company, pretending to be normal while looking for the documents they needed. The tension was palpable. Claire trembled as she rummaged through the drawers in her boss's office, but Ethan remained calm, guiding her. They found hidden folders, receipts, records of illegal transactions and copies of compromising emails. Claire tried to say something, but Ethan cut her off, saying they needed to get out of there before they were seen. When they reached the car, Claire broke down, crying and apologizing again. Ethan held her face, saying that it still didn't mean forgiveness, but that they were closer to ending it all. As they drove, Ethan felt something change. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was taking back control, but he knew the worst was yet to come. Claire was still by his side, but the trust had been broken, and he didn't know if he could fix it. The clock was almost midnight and Ethan stopped the car in front of an old building. They had the evidence, but now they needed to decide their next step. And Ethan knew that after that night, nothing would be the same again. Ethan stared at the manila envelope on the table. His hands were steady, but his heart was beating fast. The evidence was all there. Illegal transfers, forged signatures and a scheme that extended far beyond what he had imagined. The boss not only manipulated Claire, but also other employees who had fallen prey to the web of lies and threats. Ethan knew this was his last chance to resolve everything, but the weight of the decision still hung over him. Claire sat on the other side of the room, her eyes fixed on the floor as he tried to organize his thoughts. She looked more fragile than ever, but there was something in her eyes that showed she was willing to face the consequences. He stood up, took the envelope and looked at Claire. He asked if she was ready to do what needed to be done, and Claire nodded, even though her voice was choked. She said she was willing to confess everything if it meant taking down her boss and giving Ethan a chance to start over. But Ethan knew it wouldn't be that simple. The humiliation, pain and betrayal still burned inside him, and he didn't know if he could forgive her even if he tried. The next day, Ethan and Claire arrived at the lawyer's office. He handed over the documents and explained everything. The lawyer analyzed the evidence and said the evidence was more than enough to land the boss in prison, but warned that Claire could also be implicated. Claire raised her head and said that she would accept the consequences, that she had already lied for too long and that she could no longer bear that weight. Ethan was silent, watching her as she signed the statement. The news spread quickly. The boss was arrested in his office, handcuffed in front of all the employees, and the impact was devastating. Customers began canceling contracts, and the company's reputation crumbled. Claire was called to testify and faced hours of interrogation, but her statements were decisive in confirming the scheme. She was accused of complicity, but obtained a plea bargain, which reduced her sentence to community work and partial restitution of the embezzled amounts. Ethan watched everything from afar, refusing to be present during the most difficult moments. He knew Claire was trying to make amends for what she did, but for him, some things were beyond repair. The day he received the divorce papers, he signed without hesitation and let Claire keep the apartment. He no longer wanted anything to tie him to the past. Claire tried to talk to him several times, asking for one last chance, but Ethan kept his distance. He said he needed to move on and that she should do the same. She cried, saying she never stopped loving him, but he just thanked her for telling him the truth in the end and walked out the door, without looking back. Months passed, and Ethan rebuilt his life. He left the company, opened his own business and started going to new places. He still felt the weight of what happened, but he also began to free himself. On one of these outings, he met someone who made him smile again. There was no rush, just long conversations and laughter that felt natural. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could be happy again. Claire, on the other hand, took a more solitary path. She served her sentence and tried to rebuild her career, but the stain left by the scandal made everything difficult. He lived with the guilt of what he did and knew he could never get back what he lost. He tried to start over, but regret was a burden he carried every day. The boss ultimately faced the worst outcome. After being convicted of fraud and embezzlement, he lost all his assets and was abandoned by his wife, who filed for divorce as soon as the scandal came to light. In prison, he became just another number, and the power he once boasted was reduced to nothing. Ethan, now stronger and wiser, has learned to recognize the signs he previously ignored. He knew trusting again would be difficult, but he also knew he couldn't let the past define the future. Looking back, I no longer felt anger, just a silent acceptance that some lessons are learned the hard way. Claire, on the other hand, remained caught between the desire to redeem herself and the reality that certain choices cannot be erased. She wrote letters to Ethan but never sent them. He kept them in a drawer, as a reminder that the love he lost was the price for his decisions. Time passed, but the scars remained. Ethan moved on, building a new chapter for his life, while Claire remained stuck in the pages of the past. And so, each one carried the weight of their choices, proving that betrayal can destroy much more than a relationship. It can destroy dreams, trust and, sometimes, even identity itself. If you liked this impactful story, leave your comment saying what you thought. We want to know your opinion on the characters' decisions and how you would react in a situation like this. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more shocking stories like this. And remember, here on the channel, we do not support any type of betrayal. Until the next story.